Chapter 1: The Making of a King. In the late 18th century, the Ashanti Empire stood as one of the most formidable powers in West Africa. Its heart was in the dense forests of present-day Ghana, where gold shimmered in riverbeds and trade routes carried wealth between the interior and the coast. The empire was a relatively young creation, forged less than a century earlier by the legendary Osei Tutu and his chief priest, Okomfo Anakai. By the time of Osei Bonsu's birth in 1779, the Ashanti state had already grown into a political and military giant. Yet, its future would depend on the strength of the leaders who inherited the Golden Stool, the sacred symbol of unity and kingship. Among those leaders, few would leave a mark as enduring as Osei Bonsu. Osei Bonsu was born into a royal household at a time when the Ashanti were locked in constant struggle with their neighbors. His childhood was shaped by stories of battle and diplomacy, of alliances made and broken, and of the sacred responsibilities that came with ruling. The empire's prosperity depended not only on its control of gold and slaves but also on its ability to maintain order among the many states bound under the authority of Kumasi, the capital. From an early age, Bonsu would have been immersed in the rituals, traditions, and expectations of Ashanti royalty. He was taught that the king was more than a political figure. He was the guardian of the Golden Stool, the living embodiment of the Ashanti people, and the one chosen to maintain harmony between the ancestors and the living. When Bonsu was still a young man, he witnessed the turbulence of Ashanti politics. His predecessor, Osei Kwame had faced unrest and opposition, his rule marked by internal disputes that threatened the empire's stability. Factions within the royal court and among the provincial chiefs debated fiercely over who should lead. In this atmosphere of tension, Bonsu's qualities began to shine. He was known for his intelligence, his ability to listen carefully, and his commanding presence. More importantly, he had the support of influential chiefs who recognized in him the kind of leader the empire needed to restore confidence. In 1804, after years of instability, the decision was made. Osei Bonsu ascended to the throne as Asantehene, the king of the Ashanti Empire. His coronation was not only a personal triumph but a moment of renewal for the entire kingdom. The ceremony took place in Kumasi, where priests and elders summoned the spirits of the ancestors to bless the new ruler. The Golden Stool was brought forth, reminding all present that true power did not belong to the man but to the spirit of the Ashanti people. Bonsu swore oaths to protect the empire, defend its honor, and maintain justice. From that day forward, he carried the title Osei Bonsu, the elephant, a name that symbolized both strength and majesty. The early years of his reign set the tone for what would follow. Unlike some rulers who were content to preserve the status quo, Bonsu moved quickly to assert his authority. He strengthened the military, ensuring that the Ashanti army remained one of the most disciplined and feared forces in the region. He reorganized the administration of conquered territories, demanding loyalty while also allowing local traditions to continue under Ashanti oversight. His approach combined firmness with pragmatism, ensuring that the empire remained both strong and adaptable. But Osei Bonsu's vision went beyond military might. He understood the importance of trade in securing Ashanti power. The wealth of Kumasi depended on controlling the flow of goods from the interior to the coast, where European merchants awaited gold, ivory, and slaves. Yet coastal states, particularly the Fanti, sought to block Ashanti access and limit their influence. This conflict over trade would soon bring Bonsu face to face with both African rivals and European powers. The stage was set for decades of conflict and negotiation, where the Ashanti throne and the British crown would cross paths in ways that reshaped the history of West Africa. Still, in those early days of his reign, Osei Bonsu stood as a symbol of renewal. His people called him the elephant not only for his strength but also for his ability to stand firm against storms. Under his leadership, the Ashanti Empire entered one of its most dynamic periods, a time of expansion, cultural flourishing, and confrontation with the forces of the outside world. The boy who had grown up listening to the tales of Ashanti greatness was now the one responsible for carrying that greatness forward. And as he sat upon the throne in Kumasi, the weight of history pressed upon him, reminding him that his reign would be judged not only by his people but by generations yet to come. Chapter 2. The Elephant on the Throne. When Osei Bonsu took the throne in 1804, the Ashanti Empire was powerful but restless. Its influence stretched across much of present-day Ghana, yet rival states and coastal kingdoms constantly challenged Kumasi's authority. European traders along the coast, especially the British, the Dutch, and the Danes, were eager to control gold, ivory, and the slave trade. For Osei Bonsu, known as the Elephant, the throne was not a seat of comfort but a battlefield of politics, diplomacy, and war. The young king quickly made his presence felt. He knew that his first task was to restore confidence in the monarchy. The years before his rule had been marked by uncertainty, and the Ashanti chiefs wanted a ruler who could lead with strength and vision. Bonsu answered that call. He reorganized the empire's leadership structure, reminding every regional chief that loyalty to Kumasi was non-negotiable. Yet he also understood that good leadership meant balancing authority with respect. He allowed local customs to remain, as long as they did not threaten Ashanti unity. This careful balance between control and cooperation became one of the hallmarks of his rule. One of Osei Bonsu's greatest strengths was his ability to command the Ashanti army. The Ashanti were already renowned across West Africa as one of the most formidable military forces, but Bonsu took them to new heights. He invested in better training and organization, ensuring that each regiment had clear roles. The army's famous Asafo companies became more disciplined, capable of both defending the empire and striking against enemies. Soldiers carried muskets, spears, and shields decorated with traditional patterns, combining African innovation with European firearms acquired through trade. It was not long before Osei Bonsu had to test his military leadership. Along the southern frontier, the Fanti Confederacy remained a thorn in Ashanti ambitions. The Fanti controlled important coastal routes that connected the Ashanti to European traders. Bonsu understood that without direct access to the coast, the empire's trade would always be vulnerable. Conflict was inevitable, and the elephant was ready. In 1807, Osei Bonsu led a major campaign against the Fanti. The war was brutal, with both sides fighting fiercely for control of trade routes. The Ashanti army, disciplined and heavily armed, eventually broke through Fanti defenses. Villages fell, trade posts were seized, and coastal influence began to shift toward Kumasi. The victory was more than just a military success. It was a message to both Africans and Europeans. The Ashanti Empire under Osei Bonsu was not only alive but stronger than ever. These victories brought immense wealth into the empire. Gold, ivory, and enslaved people flowed through Kumasi, enriching the royal court and funding further expansion. Traders from Europe realized that they could not ignore the Ashanti. They had to negotiate with Kumasi if they wished to secure their interests on the coast. Osei Bonsu was now in a position of strength, and he used it wisely. Yet he was no fool. Bonsu understood that the Europeans were not friends but opportunists. He knew that the British, in particular, were beginning to question the transatlantic slave trade. By the early 1800s, Britain had abolished its own involvement in the trade, but British merchants still wanted Ashanti gold and palm oil. Osei Bonsu found himself navigating a new era where traditional African commerce clashed with European moral posturing and shifting economic priorities. Despite these challenges, Bonsu continued to solidify his rule at home. He strengthened Kumasi's position as the empire's political and cultural capital. Under his reign, Ashanti art, goldsmithing, and ceremonial traditions reached new heights. The royal regalia grew more elaborate, with intricate gold ornaments, symbolic umbrellas, and the ever-present Golden Stool, which remained untouchable and sacred. Bonsu's court became a center of both power and culture, where politics, tradition, and spirituality blended seamlessly. By the second decade of the 19th century, Osei Bonsu was firmly established as one of the most powerful rulers in African history. He had restored the Ashanti throne, secured major victories in war, and gained the attention of European traders who now treated Kumasi as an essential partner. His people saw him as a protector, a leader whose strength lived up to his name, the elephant. But with success came new challenges. The empire's expansion brought it into contact with more enemies, both African and European. Along the coast, tensions simmered with the British, who were increasingly unwilling to accept Ashanti dominance. In the north, other African states sought to resist Ashanti authority. And within Kumasi itself, the delicate balance of power between chiefs, priests, and the throne always required careful management. Osei Bonsu's reign had begun with triumph, but the greatest tests of his leadership were still to come. The elephant had proven his strength in battle and his wisdom in rule, but could he protect the Ashanti Empire against the rising storm of European imperial ambition? The answer would unfold in the years ahead, as the Ashanti and the British moved toward an unavoidable collision, one that would shape the destiny of West Africa for generations. Chapter 3: The Ashanti and the Coast. By the early years of the 19th century, the Ashanti Empire under Osei Bonsu had established itself as the most powerful state in West Africa. Its armies had triumphed over the Fanti, its influence reached deep into the forest and savanna, and its wealth shone through Kumasi's royal court. Yet, for all the glory, one issue remained at the center of Ashanti ambitions: control of the coast. Whoever controlled the trade routes to the Atlantic controlled the flow of wealth, and Osei Bonsu knew that without access to the coastal forts and markets, the empire's future would be limited. The coastal region, however, was not easy to dominate. The Fanti, though weakened, remained influential, while other smaller states like the Ga and the Anlo resisted Ashanti encroachment. To complicate matters further, European powers, chiefly the British, the Dutch, and the Danes, had carved out fortified trading posts along the shoreline. These forts were gateways to the Atlantic world, and through them flowed gold, ivory, guns, cloth, and slaves. For centuries, coastal peoples had acted as middlemen between the interior and the Europeans, taking advantage of their strategic location. Osei Bonsu's mission was clear: remove the middlemen and bring the Ashanti throne into direct contact with the coastal forts. One of Bonsu's first major tests came in 1811, when conflict broke out again with the Fanti and their allies. The Ashanti army, experienced and well-equipped, marched south with confidence. The campaign was fierce, with battles fought through forests and across rivers. Once more, the elephant demonstrated his ability to lead. Ashanti warriors, organized into disciplined companies, overwhelmed their opponents with both traditional weapons and firearms obtained through trade. Villages fell, chiefs were captured, and the message was clear: Kumasi would not be denied its access to the coast. But even in victory, Bonsu faced new challenges. The British, who had established themselves as the dominant European power along the Gold Coast, began to watch Ashanti expansion with suspicion. Only a few years earlier, Britain had outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, yet many British merchants still relied on African captives being sold to Spanish and Portuguese buyers. At the same time, the Ashanti economy still depended heavily on the exchange of slaves, gold, and ivory for European guns and goods. This created an uneasy tension between Kumasi and the British forts. In 1817, Osei Bonsu received a delegation from the British African Company of Merchants, led by Thomas Bodick. This moment became one of the most famous encounters in Ashanti history. Bodick and his companions traveled to Kumasi to negotiate directly with the Asantehene, hoping to secure peace and trade on terms favorable to Britain. What they witnessed left a lasting impression on European audiences. The British delegation described Kumasi as a city unlike anything they had expected in West Africa. Streets were wide and organized, the royal palace was vast, and the court ceremonies were filled with pageantry. Bodick marveled at the sight of thousands of warriors in full regalia, umbrellas of every color, drums and horns echoing through the air, and the sheer wealth of gold displayed by nobles and chiefs. At the center of it all sat Osei Bonsu, adorned in rich Kent cloth and heavy gold ornaments, exuding power and authority. For the British, it was a humbling reminder that the Ashanti were not a minor tribe but a sophisticated empire with its own political system, culture, and military might. During negotiations, Osei Bonsu made it clear that the Ashanti Empire expected recognition of its dominance over the interior, and its right to trade directly with the coastal forts. The British agreed to a treaty that formalized peaceful relations and acknowledged Ashanti power. For a brief time, it seemed as if cooperation might be possible. Kumasi gained direct ties to European traders, while the British secured a strong partner in West Africa. Yet beneath the surface, tensions remained. Osei Bonsu was determined to preserve the Ashanti way of life, including the use of slavery in both warfare and commerce. The British, though officially committed to abolition, still operated within a world economy shaped by slavery. Both sides needed each other, but their values and goals were beginning to diverge. Meanwhile, within the empire itself, Osei Bonsu continued to consolidate power. He expanded Ashanti influence northward, bringing more territories under his control. Tribute flowed into Kumasi, and the Golden Stool remained the unifying force of the empire. The Asantehene court became a center of cultural brilliance, where art, music, and ceremony reinforced the empire's identity. By the late 1810s, Osei Bonsu stood at the height of his reign. He had secured military victories, brought the British to his capital in awe, and positioned the Ashanti Empire as a central player in West African trade. To his people, he was the elephant indeed, a ruler whose strength could not be challenged. But history was moving quickly. The British presence on the coast was growing stronger, and their political ambitions were shifting. They were no longer content to trade alone. They began to imagine themselves as rulers of the entire region. For Osei Bonsu, the victories of his early reign were only the beginning. Ahead lay the great struggle that would define not only his leadership but the fate of the Ashanti Empire itself. Chapter 4: Diplomacy and Deception. By the second decade of the 19th century, Osei Bonsu, the Elephant King of the Ashanti Empire, stood as one of the most respected rulers in African history. His armies had secured dominance over rival states, his authority was unquestioned in Kumasi, and his court dazzled both his people and foreign visitors with its wealth and splendor. Yet while the Ashanti had reached new heights, the empire now faced challenges that would test Bonsu's wisdom as much as his strength. These challenges came not only from neighboring African states, but increasingly from the growing ambitions of European powers on the coast. The encounter with the British delegation in 1817 had been a turning point. Thomas Bodick and his companions left Kumasi with glowing reports of Ashanti power and grandeur, but also with a clearer sense of what Britain might gain and lose through dealings with Osei Bonsu. The treaty signed between the Ashanti and the African Company of Merchants promised peace and cooperation, yet neither side fully trusted the other. For Bonsu, the treaty was a strategic victory, cementing recognition of his empire's authority. For the British, it was an opportunity, but one they would seek to exploit in their own favor. Osei Bonsu understood the delicate nature of diplomacy. To secure the prosperity of his people, he had to walk a fine line between partnership and resistance. On one hand, European trade was essential. The Ashanti relied on muskets, gunpowder, and cloth imported from Europe. On the other hand, he knew that the Europeans were not neutral merchants. They sought influence, control, and eventually domination. The elephant did not intend to let them trample on Ashanti sovereignty. At the same time, Bonsu was faced with unrest in the wider region. Coastal peoples, who had long acted as intermediaries between the Ashanti and the Europeans, resented Kumasi's growing control. The Fanti, though defeated militarily, continued to resist politically. Smaller states like the Ga and the Anlo watched with suspicion as the Ashanti pushed closer to their territories. Bonsu recognized that his empire could not rely on force alone. He used a mixture of alliances, tribute, and intimidation to keep rivals in check, ensuring that no single group could unite against Kumasi. Within the capital, Bonsu reinforced his authority through ceremony and tradition. The Golden Stool remained at the center of Ashanti identity, never to be sat upon, never to be defiled. Festivals and processions reminded the people of their shared history and loyalty. Chiefs swore allegiance to the Asantehene, knowing that their power derived from the unity of the empire. In this way, Bonsu maintained a balance between central power and local autonomy, one of the secrets to Ashanti stability. Yet beneath the pageantry, cracks were beginning to appear. The transatlantic slave trade, which had fueled Ashanti wealth for generations, was collapsing under international pressure. Britain had banned its own slave trade in 1807 and was pressing other European powers to follow. Although slavery remained a central institution within Ashanti society, the economic model built on selling captives overseas was becoming harder to sustain. Osei Bonsu faced the challenge of adapting the empire's economy to this new reality. Gold and ivory remained valuable exports, and palm oil was beginning to rise in importance, but change came slowly. The British, meanwhile, were undergoing their own transformation. What had once been a coastal trading presence was evolving into an imperial project. Missionaries began to arrive, seeking to spread Christianity in Ashanti lands. British officials increasingly spoke not just of trade but of influence, treaties, and control. To Osei Bonsu, such moves were troubling. He welcomed commerce but resisted interference in Ashanti politics or traditions. When British agents pressed him to abandon slavery, Bonsu stood firm, declaring that his people had their own customs and would not be dictated to by foreigners. This clash of worldviews foreshadowed the conflicts to come. For Osei Bonsu, diplomacy was not weakness but strategy. He believed that the Ashanti could outmaneuver the British through negotiation, just as they had outmatched rival African states through war. And for a time it worked. Kumasi remained the unquestioned heart of West African politics, and the elephant continued to command respect. But even as Bonsu managed these challenges, the empire's fate was shifting. European influence on the coast grew year by year. Britain's abolitionist policies created tension with Ashanti economic practices. And rival African states continued to look for opportunities to resist Kumasi's dominance. As the 1820s dawned, the balance of power in West Africa was entering a dangerous new phase. Osei Bonsu had built an empire of warriors, diplomats, and traditions, but now he would face the greatest test of his reign. War with Britain was approaching, and the clash would determine whether the Ashanti Empire could remain the master of its own destiny. Chapter 5: Storm Clouds on the Horizon. By the early 1820s, the Ashanti Empire had reached the height of its power. Under Osei Bonsu, the Elephant King, Kumasi stood as a capital of wealth, order, and tradition. The empire's armies had no equal in West Africa, and its influence stretched from the forest to the savannah. Yet even at this moment of strength, new dangers were forming. The coast, long a source of trade and prosperity, was becoming a battlefield of politics. And this time, the greatest threat would not come from rival African states, but from the rising ambitions of the British Empire. For decades, the Ashanti had fought to secure access to the coast. Victories against the Fanti had opened routes to the European forts, allowing Kumasi to trade directly for muskets, cloth, and other goods. Osei Bonsu believed that this system would guarantee his empire's strength. But the world was changing. Britain had abolished the transatlantic slave trade and was beginning to enforce that policy along the West African coast. This decision directly challenged Ashanti economic traditions, which still relied heavily on capturing and selling slaves as part of warfare and diplomacy. The British, however, were not motivated only by morality. Their growing interest in palm oil, timber, and other legitimate goods made them eager to control coastal trade outright. To achieve this, they needed to weaken the Ashanti hold on the interior. The British saw the Ashanti as both a partner and a problem. On one hand, Kumasi was too powerful to ignore. On the other, its independence stood in the way of British ambitions. Osei Bonsu recognized the danger. He had dealt with European traders long enough to know that their words did not always match their intentions. While he valued commerce, he would not allow foreign interference in Ashanti customs or politics. To him, the Golden Stool symbolized the sacred unity of his people, and no outside power had the right to dictate how the Ashanti lived. Tensions escalated in 1822, when conflict broke out between the Ashanti and tribes allied with the British along the coast. Skirmishes turned into larger clashes, with both sides testing each other's strength. For the Ashanti, it was a matter of defending their right to trade freely. For the British, it was about asserting influence and protecting their allies. Soon, it became clear that neither side was willing to back down. In 1823, the situation reached a breaking point. The British governor on the Gold Coast, Sir Charles Macarthy, decided to confront the Ashanti militarily. Macarthy underestimated the strength of his opponents, believing that European discipline and technology would ensure victory. He gathered a force of British soldiers and allied African troops and marched inland toward Ashanti territory. Osei Bonsu, however, was prepared. The Ashanti army was vast, disciplined, and battle-hardened. With regiments organized into precise formations and warriors armed with muskets and spears, they were ready to defend the empire's honor. Bonsu understood that this was no ordinary conflict. It was not just about trade or territory. It was about proving that the Ashanti Empire could stand against one of the most powerful nations in the world. The two forces met at the Battle of Nsamankow in January 1824. It was one of the most dramatic clashes in West African history. The British marched with confidence, drums beating and banners flying. But they had walked into the heart of Ashanti territory, and the elephant had laid his trap. The Ashanti army surrounded the British force, cutting off their retreat. What followed was a brutal and decisive battle. Ashanti warriors attacked with relentless energy, their war drums echoing through the forest. Despite the discipline, the British troops were outnumbered and overwhelmed. Gunfire roared, spears clashed, and the fighting turned into chaos. In the midst of the battle, Governor Macarthy was struck down, his head taken as a war trophy by the Ashanti. The victory was complete. For the Ashanti, it was a moment of triumph, a reminder that even the mighty British could be defeated on African soil. News of Macarthy's death spread quickly, shocking Europe and forcing Britain to reconsider its strategy. For Osei Bonsu, the victory at Nsamankow was both a validation of his leadership and a warning of greater conflicts to come. Yet the battle also revealed the shifting nature of power in West Africa. The British might have lost at Nsamankow, but their resources, technology, and determination meant that they would return. The Ashanti had proven themselves formidable, but the war with Britain was far from over. As the dust settled, Osei Bonsu knew that the storm had only begun. The elephant had trampled his enemy once, but the British Empire was vast and persistent. Ahead lay years of struggle, diplomacy, and bloodshed, where the fate of the Ashanti Empire would hang in the balance. Chapter 6: The Aftermath of Victory. The Battle of Nsamankow in January 1824 had shaken the world. In the forests of West Africa, the Ashanti Empire under Osei Bonsu had dealt a devastating blow to the British. Governor Sir Charles Macarthy was dead, his head carried back to Kumasi as a trophy of Ashanti power. The British forces had been crushed, and the message was clear: the Ashanti were not to be underestimated. In Kumasi, the victory was celebrated with great ceremony. The drums of triumph thundered, chiefs praised their king, and the Golden Stool seemed to glow with renewed authority. For the Ashanti people, the elephant had proven his strength once again. Osei Bonsu was more than just a ruler. He was a protector, a leader chosen by the ancestors to defend the empire from foreign threat. His name spread even further across West Africa, and rival states trembled at the thought of challenging Kumasi. But Osei Bonsu was no fool. He knew that the victory, as glorious as it was, did not end the struggle. The British Empire was vast, and its resources were far greater than those of any African state. The defeat of Macarthy was a setback, but Britain would not simply walk away from the Gold Coast. Osei Bonsu prepared for the inevitable. He strengthened his armies, reinforced his alliances, and sought to ensure that Kumasi remained a fortress of both culture and power. In the years after Nsamankow, Bonsu turned his attention to maintaining order within the empire. The Ashanti realm was large, stretching across forests, rivers, and savannas, uniting many different peoples under Kumasi's authority. This unity required constant vigilance. Bonsu sent trusted generals to oversee distant provinces, ensuring that tribute continued to flow and that local chiefs remained loyal. His rule was firm but pragmatic, balancing punishment with reward. Those who resisted were crushed, but those who submitted were allowed to keep their traditions under Ashanti oversight. At the same time, Osei Bonsu continued to cultivate the grandeur of his court. The royal palace in Kumasi stood as the heart of the empire, filled with gold ornaments, carved stools, and vibrant Kent cloths. Festivals were held to honor the ancestors, with processions of chiefs carrying umbrellas, horns blasting, and drums echoing through the city. These ceremonies were not just displays of wealth. They were political tools, reminding all who watched that the Ashanti were united, powerful, and guided by the sacred Golden Stool. Yet even as Bonsu ruled with strength, the outside world was changing. The British, shocked by their defeat, began reorganizing their presence on the coast. They fortified their positions, strengthened their alliances with coastal peoples, and prepared for renewed conflict. Across the Atlantic, news of McCarthy's death stirred outrage, and the British government resolved that the Ashanti must eventually be subdued. For Osei Bonsu, the greatest challenge of his later reign was time itself. He was now an older man, no longer the young king who had taken the throne in 1804. Though still wise and commanding, his health began to decline in the years after the victory. He understood that he might not live to see the next great clash with the British, but he remained determined to leave the empire strong for his successors. Even in his final years, Bonsu sought to secure Ashanti dominance. He extended the empire's influence northward, ensuring that Kumasi remained the center of regional trade. He resisted European attempts to dictate policy, rejecting demands that the Ashanti abandon their customs or end practices central to their society. To him, sovereignty was non-negotiable. The Ashanti would live by their own laws, not by the dictates of foreigners. By 1824, Osei Bonsu had ruled for 2 decades, guiding the Ashanti Empire through both triumph and turmoil. His reign had seen expansion, diplomacy, cultural brilliance, and the first collision with the British Empire. Yet that same year, after a life of leadership, Osei Bonsu passed away. His death marked the end of an era for the Ashanti people. The elephant had fallen, but his legacy would echo for generations. The empire he left behind was strong but vulnerable. The British were regrouping, and the seeds of future wars had already been planted. Without Bonsu's steady hand, the Ashanti would face new trials in the decades to come. Still, his memory endured. To his people, Osei Bonsu remained the king who had restored Ashanti pride, who had humbled the British, and who had embodied the power of the Golden Stool. History would remember him not only as a warrior but as a statesman, a leader who balanced diplomacy with strength, and a symbol of African sovereignty in the face of foreign intrusion. The elephant had left his mark on West Africa, and the story of Osei Bonsu would continue to inspire long after his passing. Chapter 7: After the Elephant. When Osei Bonsu, the Elephant King, passed away in 1824, the Ashanti Empire mourned the loss of one of its greatest rulers. For 20 years he had defended the Golden Stool, expanded the empire, and humbled its enemies. His triumph over the British at the Battle of Nsamankow had brought glory to Kumasi, and reminded the world that the Ashanti Empire was a force to be reckoned with. Yet his death left behind a question that would shape the future. Without the elephant, could the empire stand as strong against the storms that lay ahead? The funeral of Osei Bonsu was a moment of profound ceremony. Chiefs from across the empire gathered in Kumasi to honor the fallen king. Drums thundered through the night, priests called upon the ancestors, and the Golden Stool was carried into view as a reminder that while kings might pass, the soul of the Ashanti people endured. The mourning was not only for a leader but for a symbol. Bonsu had represented stability, wisdom, and strength. His absence created uncertainty, and uncertainty could be dangerous in a kingdom built upon unity. The succession was carefully managed. The Ashanti political system, though centered on the Asantehene, was guided by the Queen Mother and the Council of Chiefs. Together, they ensured that the new king would be chosen from the royal line, continuing the sacred duty of protecting the Golden Stool. After deliberation, Osei Bonsu, a nephew of Osei Bonsu, became the next Asantehene. His reign began in the shadow of his predecessor's greatness and under the looming threat of continued conflict with the British. The empire that Osei inherited was powerful but vulnerable. The victory at Nsamankow had strengthened Ashanti pride, but it had also provoked British determination. London could not ignore the humiliation of McCarthy's death. Reinforcements and new strategies were already being planned, and the coastal forts were becoming increasingly militarized. The British, with their vast resources, were preparing for a long struggle to assert control over the Gold Coast. At the same time, internal strains began to emerge. Osei Bonsu's leadership had kept rival factions in check, but without his commanding presence, disputes among chiefs became harder to manage. Some provincial leaders sought greater independence, testing the limits of Kumasi's authority. Though Osei Kota worked to maintain order, his reign lacked the same unifying aura as Bonsu's. Despite these challenges, the Ashanti Empire remained formidable. Its army was still one of the largest and best organized in Africa. Warriors continued to train in the Asafo companies, and muskets flowed into the empire through trade. Tribute from conquered territories sustained Kumasi, and festivals and ceremonies reinforced loyalty to the Golden Stool. The Ashanti still stood as masters of the interior, but the world around them was shifting rapidly. One of the greatest changes was economic. The decline of the transatlantic slave trade forced the Ashanti to adapt. Osei Bonsu had resisted European demands to end slavery, insisting on Ashanti sovereignty. His successors faced the same dilemma. While gold and ivory remained valuable exports, palm oil was emerging as a new trade good. The British increasingly promoted this legitimate commerce, hoping to replace slavery with new economic ties. For the Ashanti, however, the transition was slow and uneasy. Slavery remained embedded in the fabric of society, not just as an economic system but as a political and cultural institution. The years following Osei Bonsu's death also revealed the growing divide between Ashanti traditions and European ambitions. Missionaries expanded their presence on the coast, spreading Christianity and criticizing what they saw as pagan practices. British officials used abolitionist language to justify deeper interference in West African politics. For the Ashanti, this was not simply about economics. It was about identity, sovereignty, and survival. As tensions with the British continued, Ashanti leaders often invoked the memory of Osei Bonsu. To them, he was the model of resistance, the king who had stood firm against foreign pressure and proven that the Ashanti could triumph even against the European empire. His legacy served as inspiration, a reminder that unity and courage could defend the Golden Stool against any threat. Yet the reality was harsh. Without Bonsu's steady leadership, the Ashanti found it harder to navigate the complex politics of diplomacy and war. The British were persistent, their resources seemingly endless. Skirmishes and negotiations continued throughout the 1820s and 1830s, setting the stage for the renewed wars that would dominate the rest of the 19th century. In this way, the death of Osei Bonsu marked both an end and a beginning. It ended the era of the elephant, a time when the Ashanti stood at their absolute peak. But it also began a new chapter, one of survival against the rising tide of European imperialism. To his people, Osei Bonsu remained a legend. His victories, his grandeur, and his defiance became part of Ashanti memory, passed down through stories, songs, and ceremonies. Even as new kings rose and fell, the elephant's shadow loomed large over Kumasi. He was the measure by which future rulers would be judged, and the standard of Ashanti sovereignty in an age of foreign encroachment. Chapter 7 After the Elephant. When Osei Bonsu, the Elephant King, died in 1824, the Ashanti Empire entered a period of deep mourning. For 2 decades he had defended the Golden Stool, humbled rivals, and held the British at bay. His death was not only the loss of a ruler, but the loss of a unifying force whose wisdom and authority had kept the kingdom strong. The question on everyone's mind was simple: without Osei Bonsu, could the Ashanti Empire remain as powerful as it once was? The funeral ceremonies in Kumasi were vast and unforgettable. Chiefs from every corner of the empire gathered to honor their fallen Asantehene. Drums thundered through the night, warriors fired muskets into the air, and priests called upon the spirits of the ancestors. The Golden Stool was brought forward, reminding all that while kings might pass, the spirit of the Ashanti people lived on. Yet beneath the rituals was a sense of unease. Bonsu's strength had held the empire together. Now that he was gone, new divisions and challenges were already beginning to appear. The process of succession was crucial. In Ashanti tradition, the throne did not pass directly from father to son but was chosen through the royal matrilineal line, guided by the Queen Mother and the Council of Chiefs. After much debate, Osei Bonsu, a nephew of Osei Bonsu, was chosen as the new Asantehene. His reign began under the heavy shadow of his predecessor. He inherited a throne surrounded by enemies and watched closely by the British, who had not forgotten their humiliating defeat at the Battle of Nsamankow. Although Osei Bonsu had left behind a strong army and a wealthy empire, the situation was fragile. The British, angered by the death of Governor Charles McCarthy, were determined to strike back. They had vast resources and were preparing to send reinforcements to the Gold Coast. At the same time, internal divisions were quietly growing inside the Ashanti state. Some provincial chiefs, no longer held firmly in check by Bonsu's authority, began pushing for greater independence. For Osei Bonsu, maintaining unity within the empire would prove almost as difficult as resisting the British. Economically, the empire was also facing a time of change. The transatlantic slave trade was declining, and Britain was pressuring West African states to abandon slavery altogether. Osei Bonsu had strongly resisted such demands, declaring that no foreign power could dictate the empire's customs. But with Bonsu gone, the issue returned. Gold and ivory remained important exports, and palm oil was becoming more valuable, yet slavery was still deeply embedded in Ashanti society. For Kumasi, adapting to this new economic reality was not easy. The cultural clash between the Ashanti and the British also became sharper. Missionaries increased their presence on the coast, spreading Christianity and criticizing Ashanti traditions. British officials used the language of abolition and civilization to justify deeper involvement in African affairs. To the Ashanti, these moves looked less like moral reform and more like an excuse for foreign domination. Protecting the Golden Stool and preserving their independence became even more urgent. In these years, the memory of Osei Bonsu remained powerful. Chiefs and warriors often invoked his name, remembering him as the king who had stood tall against the British and defended the empire's honor. His leadership was seen as a model for what it meant to be a Asantehene, wise in council, fearless in battle, and unwavering in loyalty to the Golden Stool. Yet while his memory inspired unity, his absence created a gap that was difficult to fill. Osei Bonsu and his council tried to follow Bonsu's path, but the challenges were enormous. The empire was still strong, but cracks were beginning to show. The British were persistent, and their influence on the coast grew each year. Meanwhile, internal rivalries among Ashanti leaders risked weakening the unity that Bonsu had fought so hard to maintain. The death of Osei Bonsu marked the end of an era. It was the close of a time when the Ashanti Empire stood at its height, feared and respected across West Africa. But it also opened a new chapter, one where the empire would face a long and bitter struggle against European imperial ambition. The early campaigns after Bonsu's death were marked by victories and setbacks on both sides. The Ashanti managed to reclaim influence inland, reminding their enemies that the empire was still a force to be reckoned with. But in the coastal regions, British forts and cannons posed a serious challenge. The Ashanti could march to the coast, but holding ground there became increasingly difficult. Despite these challenges, the memory of Osei Bonsu inspired warriors and chiefs alike. Elders often reminded the younger generation of how the Elephant King had humbled the British at Nsamankow. His example was used to stir courage in times of doubt. Songs and war chants carried his name, ensuring that even though he was gone, his spirit marched with the army. But war was costly. The economy suffered as trade slowed, and constant mobilization strained resources. Villages were burned, farmland disrupted, and families displaced. For ordinary Ashanti people, these years were filled with uncertainty. While loyalty to the Golden Stool remained strong, whispers of discontent began to spread in the provinces. The empire's strength was still impressive, but the cracks were beginning to widen. Meanwhile, British strategy was evolving. They were no longer content with holding isolated forts. Their long-term goal was to dominate the Gold Coast completely, using treaties and military campaigns to weaken Ashanti power. Every clash brought them closer to this aim, even when they suffered defeats. Unlike Osei Bonsu, who had kept the British at arm's length, the new Ashanti faced a foe more determined than ever. By the end of the 1820s, the Ashanti were still holding their ground inland, but the coast was slipping further from their grasp. The empire stood tall, but it was beginning to fight on unfavorable terms. The wars were no longer just about tribute or trade, they were about survival. The fire that had been lit during Osei Bonsu's reign was still burning, but now it threatened to consume the empire itself. The Ashanti had faced many enemies before, from rival Akan states to northern invaders, and each time they had triumphed. Yet the British were different. They brought not only weapons but also a global empire behind them. Osei Bonsu's successors had inherited his throne, his army, and his enemies, but not his unmatched authority. The question that now hung in the air was whether the Ashanti could adapt to these changing times or whether the age of the elephant was already behind them. Chapter 9: Cracks in the Golden Stool. The death of Osei Bonsu in 1824 left behind more than an empire. It left behind a question: could the Ashanti remain united without the Elephant King's steady hand? His memory still loomed large, and his victories were sung by warriors and elders alike. But the years following his reign revealed just how fragile the balance truly was. Chapter 9: Cracks in the Golden Stool. The death of Osei Bonsu in 1824 left behind more than an empire. It left behind a question: could the Ashanti remain united without the Elephant King's steady hand? His memory still loomed large, and his victories were sung by warriors and elders alike. But the years following his reign revealed just how fragile the balance truly was. The Ashanti Empire remained powerful, but pressures were mounting on all sides. The British had not forgotten their humiliation at the Battle of Nsamankow. Every loss to the Ashanti had been recorded in London as a challenge to British prestige. By the 1830s, they were more determined than ever to expand control across the Gold Coast. Their forts along the coast, once just trading posts, were now military and political centers. Step by step, they tightened their influence over local states, offering them protection against the Ashanti in exchange for allegiance. This shift created dangerous cracks in the Ashanti alliance system. Many of the coastal states that had once submitted to Osei Bonsu's authority began to turn their eyes toward the British. The lure of trade, the promise of protection, and the growing power of Europe made defiance easier than loyalty. For the Ashanti kings who followed Bonsu, every rebellion meant another drain on resources, another war to fight, another weakening of their central authority. The Golden Stool, the sacred heart of the Ashanti, was still the unifying symbol of the empire. Chiefs and commoners swore loyalty to it, believing it carried the soul of the people. Yet even sacred tradition was not enough to silence doubts. Could the Ashanti really resist the growing tide of European power? Could the spirit of Osei Bonsu guide them forever, or had his death marked the beginning of the empire's decline? Economically, the strain was becoming clear. Trade routes that had once brought wealth from gold, cola nuts, and even slaves were disrupted by constant warfare. The British controlled more of the coastal exchanges, reducing the Ashanti's access to European firearms and goods. Without steady supplies of weapons, their armies, still vast in number, were slowly losing their edge. Internally, rivalries began to stir. Osei Bonsu had been able to maintain unity because of his personal authority, his battlefield success, and his ability to command respect. His successors, while capable, did not carry the same weight. Disputes among chiefs over tribute, territory, and succession grew louder. While the empire had not fractured, the seeds of division were being planted. Still, the Ashanti were far from finished. They continued to project their power inland, subduing rivals and reminding the world that Kumasi was still the beating heart of West Africa. Travelers and traders who came to the Ashanti capital marveled at its order, its wealth, and its disciplined society. Ashanti gold still glittered, and their artisans continued to craft jewelry, regalia, and weapons that demonstrated the empire's unmatched culture. Yet the external threat was growing. The British were no longer interested in being just partners in trade. They were representatives of an expanding global empire, one that sought complete dominance of the Gold Coast. By the mid-1830s, British officials were already laying the groundwork for greater control, making treaties that weakened Ashanti influence and preparing for future wars that would test the empire to its limits. For the Ashanti people, Osei Bonsu remained a symbol of what was possible. His reign had been a golden moment, when the empire had stood taller than any rival. Chiefs recalled his strategies, his speeches, and his fearlessness in the face of foreign powers. His name became a measure for the kings who followed him. Could they match the elephant's strength? Could they hold the empire together as he had? The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Without Osei Bonsu, the Ashanti were strong, but they were not invincible. Their enemies were multiplying, their trade was shrinking, and their unity was being tested. Each year after his death, the gap between the Ashanti of old and the challenges of the present grew wider. By the end of the 1830s, the empire still stood proud, but the cracks in the Golden Stool could be seen by those who looked closely. They were not literal cracks, of course, for the stool itself remained sacred and untouchable. But in the loyalty of vassals, the strength of the army, and the balance of trade, the empire was slowly beginning to weaken. The British could sense it. The coastal allies could sense it. And even within Kumasi, whispers of doubt began to rise. The Elephant King had left behind a towering legacy, but legacies alone could not win wars. The Ashanti were entering a new age, one where the memory of Osei Bonsu would serve as both inspiration and a haunting reminder of what was slipping away. The empire was still a lion, feared and respected, but the hunters were drawing closer. Chapter 10: The Lasting Legacy of Osei Bonsu. The story of Osei Bonsu does not end with his death in 1824. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a longer struggle that would define the Ashanti Empire for the rest of the 19th century. His reign became the standard by which all Ashanti rulers were measured, and his victories were remembered as a high point in African resistance to foreign domination. But history would prove that no empire, however powerful, could remain untouched forever. After Bonsu's passing, the Ashanti continued to fight. His successors carried forward his military traditions and tried to preserve the unity of the Golden Stool. Wars against the British and their coastal allies became more frequent. In each of these conflicts, the memory of Osei Bonsu's triumph at Nsamankow was invoked as a call to arms. Chiefs reminded their warriors that they were the descendants of the men who had once defeated a European army. For a time, that spirit kept the Ashanti strong. Yet the balance of power was changing. The British were no longer just traders with muskets and cannons. By the mid to late 1800s, they had become part of a global empire stretching across Africa and Asia. Steamships carried reinforcements faster than ever. Industrial factories in Britain produced endless supplies of modern rifles, artillery, and ammunition. The Ashanti still fought bravely, but they faced an enemy with resources on a scale beyond imagination. Still, resistance did not end. Throughout the 19th century, Kumasi remained a fortress of independence. The Ashanti did not surrender their lands, their traditions, or their Golden Stool. Even when they were outnumbered and outgunned, they fought to protect the soul of their people. This determination itself was a legacy of Osei Bonsu. He had shown his people that no empire, no matter how advanced, could simply walk over the Ashanti without cost. By the end of the century, however, the struggle reached its breaking point. After decades of wars, blockades, and treaties, the British finally launched a full-scale invasion in 1896. Kumasi fell, and the Asantehene was forced into exile. A few years later, in 1900, the famous War of the Golden Stool erupted, when the British attempted to claim the sacred symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. Even then, long after Bonsu's time, the spirit of resistance lived on. Men and women rose up, declaring that the Golden Stool could never belong to foreigners. The Ashanti fought with the same pride Osei Bonsu had once inspired, proving that his legacy still shaped their courage. In the end, the Ashanti Empire was absorbed into the British colony known as the Gold Coast, which later became modern Ghana. But unlike many conquered peoples, the Ashanti did not lose their identity. Their traditions, their language, their chieftaincy, and their reverence for the Golden Stool all survived. And at the heart of that survival was the memory of leaders like Osei Bonsu, who had stood firm in an age of rising foreign power. Today, historians remember Osei Bonsu not only as a warrior king but as a strategist who understood the shifting tides of his world. He expanded the empire's borders, secured trade routes, and brought a measure of stability to a vast and diverse state. His ability to command respect from allies and fear from enemies set him apart as one of Africa's great rulers. His reign demonstrated that African kingdoms were not passive victims of European expansion but active powers capable of victory. In Ghana, the Ashanti people still honor his legacy. His name is spoken with reverence among chiefs and elders. His reign is taught in schools as part of the proud history of resistance and statecraft. The Golden Stool remains untouchable, a symbol of continuity linking the present with the glory of the past. For the wider world, Osei Bonsu's story challenges old stereotypes about Africa's past. Too often, history was written from the European perspective, portraying Africa as weak and divided. But the reality is that rulers like Bonsu built empires, led armies, and created systems of governance that rivaled those of Europe and Asia. His story is a reminder that Africa's history is rich with leaders who fought not only to defend their people but to define their place in the world. The Ashanti Empire may no longer rule the lands it once commanded, but its spirit endures. And at the center of that spirit stands Osei Bonsu, the Elephant King, whose strength carried his people through one of the most challenging eras in African history. His victories, his leadership, and his unyielding pride remain a timeless lesson. That even in the face of overwhelming odds, a people united by tradition and courage can stand tall. Osei Bonsu's legacy is not only the story of a king. It is the story of resistance, resilience, and identity. A story that continues to echo from the forests of Ghana to the pages of world history.